The anthropomorphization of animals, or the act of giving human characteristics to an animal in a work of art or fiction, is a very, very old idea. In ancient Egypt, most of the gods they worshipped had animal heads and human bodies. My not at all scholarly guess is that this was to help you distinguish between them. Water buffalo head, gotta be Khnum, Lord of the Nile. Hippo head, that's Tauret, goddess of pregnancy. Weird dog-like thing that no modern scholar has been able to identify, that's Set, the evil guy who lives in the desert. Even the gods with human faces still often had animal characteristics, like Isis, Nephthys, and Ma'at having bird wings. Man, if I had a nickel, I'd have 3 nickels. Meanwhile, over in India, the Hindu belief of reincarnation meant that human was just one possible vessel for your eternal soul, and if you were a really good person, one day you just might be a cow. But more common is the concept of animals taking on supernatural roles, either as gods or heroes, such as Coyote and Raven in indigenous North American traditions, to Anansi the Spider in Africa, and later to Sun Wukong, Monkey King, starring in the seminal Chinese novel Journey to the West. When these and other animal characters were portrayed in theater and later film, it was typically done by putting a human actor in a costume, which automatically anthropomorphizes the character by at minimum giving them human limb and body proportions. In Paramount's Alice adaptation, the White Rabbit wasn't a literal rabbit they dubbed lines for, they put a guy in a rabbit suit.
I hate you.
Essentially, until the advent of CGI, this was the norm for portraying a talking animal character in live action. In animation, you could get away with a more realistic animal portrayal, such as in Bambi, but even there, the characters are given larger and more front-facing eyes, and more malleable faces to better approximate human expressions and vocalizations.
Bird!
Thumper and Flower also sit up on their hind legs a lot more often than their wild counterparts would, and certainly real skunks, as far as I'm aware, do not have the capacity to blush. Given this vast history of humanizing animals, it should come as no surprise that eventually some humans would want to animalize themselves in art or fiction, or even in real life. What we would now call a furry is someone who views themselves as an animal, anthropomorphized or otherwise, or likes to role-play as an animal without actually believing themselves to be one, or just enjoys consuming media centered on anthropomorphized animals. Now, this may seem vague to the point of unhelpfulness, but there is in fact a diversity of folks who consider themselves to be furries, and I guarantee that no matter how carefully I try to define furry subgroups, someone in the comments is going to disagree and argue that I've mischaracterized their particular niche cohort. Just know that I'm trying my best as someone who is not a member of this particular community. From what I can gather, those furries that do view themselves as actually being an animal, whether physically or mentally or spiritually, fall into the bracket of otherkin or therian. That latter name seems to come from the word therianthropy, the magical ability to transform into an animal. However, it seems most furries view their animalizing as purely roleplay, even though some may fantasize about actually being a non-human animal. The animal they choose for this roleplay is known as their fursona, and by a wide margin, most furries have fursonas that are not just mammals, but carnivores. Cats, dogs, bears, wolves, and foxes are the most common. Now, some furries who happen to have a fair bit of disposable income will procure or even hand-make a fursuit, which gives us the image that most non-furries have of them. There are furry catering websites like Fur Affinity and furry conventions, and of course there's the meme that if a plane full of furries ever crashed, all the world's IT departments would suddenly be gone. Also, the furry fandom is majority queer, with WebMD finding that only a third of furries identify as straight, and anecdotally there is a fairly strong correlation between being a furry and being neurodivergent. This has the consequence that despite all the ridicule that furries often get from the normies, the furry fandom is one of the most accepting and tolerant groups you can possibly find. History is littered with folk who held an affinity for animals, but this was typically for spiritual reasons. Shamans in Native American traditions were believed to be able to communicate with or even transform into animals. There are also recurring myths of magical creatures that could shift between human and animal forms, such as the Selkie and the werewolf. But records of individuals role-playing as animals for fun, let alone entire communities, is rather hard to track in the historical record prior to photography. There are a few old photos circulating claiming to be Victorian fursuits, but these seem to be theatrical costumes, not vehicles for private roleplay. Up until not even the last 100 years, claiming you were an animal animal was a great way to get put in an insane asylum. The modern furry movement, using specifically the word furry, seems to have originated in the late 1970s. One of the first publications catering to this community was Footy, which in its very first issue billed itself as No Humans Allowed. As you can see, it originally featured a wider variety of anthropomorphisms, including plants and rocks and computers, but fairly quickly it was humanized animals that took the spotlight. Footy also notably published, if not porn, at the very least explicit sexual acts of these proto-furries. So yes, that association has been there from the very beginning. However, if you talk to a furry today, it is unlikely they'll mention something like Footy as being what got them into the fandom. No, they're probably going to talk about a book they read or a movie they watched that prominently featured animal characters, like Kimba the White Lion, which we'll talk about in more detail in a later video, or Watership Down, or the Redwall and Warriors series. But there is one particular film that is referenced more than any other and happened to come out in theaters but 3 years before the release of the first issue of Footy, Disney's Robin Hood. Yes, today we're talking about the beloved classic, The Story of Robin Hood, released in 1952, Disney's second fully live-action feature after Treasure Island. This is that treasured masterpiece that spawned 1,000 furries, right? Right? Oh, I am being told by my imaginary producer that this is not the beloved classic, but actually a mostly forgotten movie that's largely a ripoff of the 1938 actual classic, The Adventures of Robin Hood, starring Errol Flynn. But apparently you can view said ripoff on Disney+. Well, while we're here, let's talk about the legend of Robin Hood. Robin Hood is one of the most enduring and well-known figures of English folklore. Similar to King Arthur, it's highly unlikely there was a historical Robin Hood, but the stories about him and his merry men have settled into a more specific historical time frame, that of the reigns of Kings Richard and John. He's an outlaw who lives in Sherwood Forest with his band of archer thieves, constantly fighting or running from the nefarious Sheriff of Nottingham. He is unrivaled with the bow and not a bad hand with the sword either. And of course, his only true love is the maid Marian, who was usually held as ward or sometimes hostage by the sheriff or Prince John. The earliest surviving attestation to Robin Hood is the Middle English ballad Robin Hood and the Monk. As should be clear just from the title, this version is very steeped in Christianity, much more so than most modern retellings. Robin, who here is devoted to the Virgin Mary rather than a noble maiden, laments that it's been a fortnight since he last went to Mass, and it is in the church at prayer that he is discovered by a monk whom he previously robbed, who snitches on him to the sheriff. Robin's rescue is left to Little John, who frequently refers to him that died on tree. Despite this supposed religious fervor, Little John and Much the Miller's son end up killing the snitch monk and rescuing Robin from prison through various deceptions. The king in this story goes unnamed, simply referred to as our king. Thus, this first iteration lacks Marian, Friar Tuck, Alan a Dale, and any reference to Richard or John Plantagenet. Robin is also notably not a noble of Locksley or Huntingdon, but simply a yeoman, the medieval version of middle class. The original Robin Hood wasn't some aristocrat slumming it in the woods for kicks, nor did he have a monarchist hard-on for a good king. He was simply an outlaw and nothing more. Wanting to reinstate Richard over John and being in love with a noblewoman, core elements of his tale today would come later, presumably to make him a more palatable figure for a middle or upper class audience. Again, it always comes back to class. But why this time period then? Why these kings? Richard I is one of the most fondly remembered of English monarchs, having taken up the call to crusade, something that would have been viewed very positively by the much more devout Christians of medieval Britain. Despite this, he spoke barely a few words of English and spent almost all of his time when not on crusade in Norman holdings in modern France. Meanwhile, John, his younger brother, lost all of England's holdings in France, earning him the moniker Lackland, was excommunicated when he refused to accept the Pope's choice for Archbishop of Canterbury, and was in general such a shit king that his barons revolted against him and forced him to sign the Magna Carta. He also did actually try to usurp his brother while Richard was on crusade. What a fucker. So when looking for a king to serve as antagonist for our outlaw, now best known for keeping the motto, rob from the rich to give to the poor, who better than the guy who instituted so many new taxes that his vassals rose up against him and turned England into into a constitutional monarchy. Now, you could argue that the loss of Norman holdings and the expenses of Richard's crusade and later his ransom meant that the crown needed new avenues of revenue, but even in that lens, John's taxes were exorbitant.
Stamp acts, Townsend acts, sugar acts, tea acts.
What we will soon see in Disney's animated film is honestly not that much of an exaggeration. But on that note, what does any of this have to do with furries? Well, one of those old tales about anthropomorphized animals is that of Renard the fox. He was a trickster hero, fighting or outwitting his main rival, Isengrim the wolf. They lived in a society of animals ruled by King Noble the lion. While these stories were incredibly popular in medieval times to the point where the word for fox in modern French is renard, they are now rather obscure in modern Anglophone culture, particularly since there isn't really a good, well-known English translation of his French escapades. It also doesn't help that, rather than there being one singular narrative, Renard and the other animals were mostly used as stock characters to tell stories in a variety of genres. One of those ancillary animal characters was Chanticleer the rooster, whom you may remember I briefly talked about in the Sword in the Stone video. Both Renard and Chanticleer were floated as subjects for a Disney animated feature since the 30s. Chanticleer came the closest to being realized, with quite a lot of concept art being created in the early 60s, only for Walt to nix the project in favor of King Arthur, much to the chagrin of the animators. In that version, Renard would have been the villain, as Walt didn't think a trickster fox would have worked well as a protagonist. Well, after Walt's death, both ideas came back into discussion when it was decided that the next feature after the Aristocats was going to be Robin Hood. Willie Reitherman wanted to explore doing their animated take of the legend with animal characters, probably to distinguish it from Disney's live-action iteration a couple decades prior, and artist Ken Anderson decided to cast Renard the Fox in the lead role. This pretty logically led to Isengrim the Wolf as the Sheriff of Nottingham, despite Anderson initially wanting the villain to subversively be a goat, and Prince John and King Richard being lions. Anderson had also wanted to set the film in the American South, because he had apparently really liked working on Song of the South, but that idea, thankfully, was also quickly squashed, with the only remnant of that being Pat Buttram's drawl as the sheriff. In fact, accent ended up playing a very interesting role in the film. Unlike other American films at the time, where the good guy had an American accent and the baddie had a British one, in Robin Hood, the nobles all have British accents, while the peasants and yeomen have American ones, regardless of moral character. This makes this film the one where casting Phil Harris makes the most goddamn sense, and for that reason, I will actually call his character Little John.
Borrow? Boy, are we in debt.
For the titular character was hired Brian Bedford, who was largely a theater actor, having by that point already won a Tony, an Obie, and multiple Drama Desk awards, and after voicing Foxy Robin Hood would go on to mostly do a hell of a lot of Shakespeare.
Unlike some other Robin Hoods, I can speak with an English accent.
Disney executives apparently saw him on stage in Los Angeles and immediately nabbed him.
Rob? That's a naughty word. We never rob.
Opposite him is Peter Ustinov, who brings both childish tantrums and legitimate malevolence to a surprisingly well-dimensioned role.
Forgive me a cruel chuckle. Power.
This is also a time of high tension for the Disney studio. We have not yet reached the drama of the Dark Age, but even here, with the authority of Walt gone, there were more disagreements than before. Ken Anderson and Willie Reitherman clashed regularly, and not just about which species the sheriff should be. He and a lot of the animators were frustrated that Woolley continued to make what were felt to be safe decisions when new talent like Don Bluth wanted to innovate the way Walt had back in the 30s and 40s. And it didn't help that a lot of the foundational members of the company were leaving. Roy O. Disney, Walt's brother, having just formally taken on the position of CEO, died in 1971, and Robin Hood would be the last film for animator John Lounsbury, one of the 9 old men, who died in 1976, and the rest of them would die or retire themselves in pretty short order following him. The position of CEO would change hands quite frequently for the next decade, first passing to Don Tatum, for whom there is rather little information online about how much involvement he had with feature animation. Even Disney's own website only touts his work with Walt Disney World. He is notable almost entirely for being the first person in charge of the Disney company who wasn't of the Disney family, and the only entry in the canon whose release he oversaw was Robin Hood. Disney's animated take on the tale is much like their prior live-action action effort, mostly a ripoff of the 1938 Errol Flynn vehicle. Richard is on crusade, so John raises the taxes for his own profit, and then in an archery tournament where the grand prize is a golden arrow handed out by Maid Marian, a disguised Robin is captured after winning. It's really not subtle if you've seen both movies, and this would not be the last time Disney would do something like this. Both Beauty and the Beast and The Hunchback of Notre Dame have far more in common with early black and white adaptations than the original written material they were purportedly based on. This movie opens with Alan a Dale, the minstrel of the Merry Men, here a rooster, a nod to Chanticleer, voiced by Roger Miller.
And my job is to tell it like it is, or was, or whatever.
Roger also wrote and sung all but one of the songs in this film, and hot damn are they all bangers. All except one of the songs in this movie have been covered or sampled in other songs or films, and the one exception is itself a cover, it turns out, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. The songs are great, and George Bruns, as usual, masterfully works them into the score, which also, as usual, is fantastic. At times it has a sensibility of front porch banjo playing somewhere in an Appalachian swamp, which, and I mean that in the most positive way. At other times it's more classical, and still others vibing 70s rock with twanky guitar. The music, combined with the animalizing of the characters, really makes this particular iteration of Robin Hood stand out. Our story begins with Robin Hood and Little John bromancing their way through the forest, and I gotta say, after marathoning 2 live-action Robin Hood movies before this one, I really appreciate that we don't see how the two of them meet. Not everything has to be an origin story, and Robin Hood in particular isn't contained by one singular narrative. He had all sorts of adventures. I love that this opening scene, just running away from the Sheriff of Nottingham, immediately gives us the vibe of a Saturday morning cartoon with a recurring villain. In less than a minute, we establish the relevant dynamics of our key players, all set to the banger that is Oodalali.
Oodalali, golly, what a day.
However, I do like that Robin and Little John trying to walk across a bridge at the same time and falling off is still a reference to their traditional meeting story. It's also notable that Wooly decided to nix all the merry men, winnowing it down to just Robin and Little John, wanting it to be a buddy picture. This changes the dynamic from a group of revolutionary partisans hiding out in the woods to almost a Batman and Robin type deal, with a pair of superheroes protecting the townsfolk. And I kinda like the change. Joining a band of outlaws means giving up your home and livelihood, whereas the villagers in this film are still trying to keep some amount of normalcy, aided by Robin, who has sacrificed his normalcy for the greater good.
Yeah, the next time that sheriff will probably have a rope around our necks.
The furry peasants of Nottingham still support our foxy hero. There's just not really that much they can realistically do about Prince John and his soldiers and taxes. Speaking of, here comes our villain, rolling along in a golden carriage.
Beautiful, lovely taxes.
Yes, our glorious blonde-haired leader with a shitty hairdo covering himself in literal gold, all his clothing ill-fitting, obsessed with accruing more power and wealth, wanting to appear strong while in reality being feeble and mocked relentlessly for it, and constantly comparing himself to a better-liked predecessor. Whom could I possibly be talking about here? And of course, at President John's side is Elon Musk, Sir Hiss, voiced by Terry Thomas, a character actor with a staggeringly large career, here playing exactly to type as a lisping upper-crust sycophant.
Perfect fit, sire.
Now, we just had a weak and incompetent villain in Edgar the Butler, and I talked at length about what a poor villain he makes. The difference with Prince John is that he's in power.
This crown gives me a feeling of power! Power!
He's a cowardly little shit, and everyone knows it, but he's the one paying the cops. Rhino guards. So his toddler tantrums are backed up with force. And Peter Ustinov is just perfect in this role. Live-action Prince Johns are often mustache-twirly yet ineffectual, sneering in the background but not particularly memorable. This version is hammed up to all hell. Ustinov is practically chewing on that golden carriage.
Oh, the richest plum of them all, Notting Ham.
His Prince John, rather than the cool and collected Iago scheming from afar, is instead an unpredictable menace, essentially a slightly less foul-mouthed and minded Joffrey. This makes him very effective as a villain, as even though he isn't physically imposing, his threats are never idle.
I sentence you to sudden, instant, and even immediate death.
Our story proper kicks off with Robin convincing Little John to help him rob the prince's parade.
Wait a minute, there's a law against robbing royalty. I'll catch you later.
What?
And to do so, they disguise themselves as female fortune tellers.
Get the dope with your horoscope?
What I like about this is it doesn't feel in any way homophobic or transphobic, the way a lot of man pretends to be a woman plots tend to go. The joke is not, they're pretending to be women. It's about this being an effective disguise.
Oh, Bobbycock, female bandits, what next? Rubbish.
There's no...
Does this dress make me look fat?
Robin and Little John are completely comfortable in skirts, wigs, and earrings, sliding them on with a practiced hand, and clearly having such costumes on hand implies they do this sort of thing pretty regularly. I love everything about this scene, with our outlaws blatantly stealing everything that isn't nailed down, with Sir Hiss aghast and Prince John oblivious until the very end, prompting him to shove his right-hand snake in his seat cushion.
You hear that hiss? Oh, he's in the basket.
Despite his initial protests, Little John ends up grabbing the bulk of the boodle.
Solid gold hubcaps.
And once the two of them have snatched up as much as they can carry, they hoof it back into the woods, and the decapped wheels quickly fly off their axles, leaving Prince John in the mud in his underwear. Of course, Sir Hiss can't help stating the obvious, which leads to a royal outburst.
7 years bad. Ooh.
Luck.
What a ride! We have now established Robin's effectiveness as a thief, his cleverness and wit, and given Prince John very good reason to hate our protagonist. The film then makes it very clear how much of an impact the prince's taxes are having on the people of Nottingham, with the sheriff making his rounds about the town.
Prince John says that taxes should hurt.
He even literally takes a coin from a baby! This wolf has no qualms about what he's doing, even though he knows full well what he's doing is wrong.
Now save your sermon, preacher. It ain't Sunday, you know.
Where have I seen someone claim to be Christian then get mad at a religious figure for calling them out on their cruelty? I'm sure this has no real-world parallels at all.
They call me a slob, but I do my job.
But of course, these unreasonable taxes are the entire reason why Robin is doing what he's doing, so he shows up to offer tax relief to those affected.
I only wish I could do more.
And since it's Skippy's birthday, he also gets a kid-sized bow and arrow and Robin's own hat.
Don't worry, you'll grow into it, young man.
Now, kid performances walk a very fine line between being annoying and being charming. The kittens from Aristocats leaned a bit more toward annoying, particularly Marie, but the kids here are rather more endearing.
Why do snakes in a lizard's head? If I tell her, I'll die till I'm dead.
Of course, the first time Skippy shoots his bow, the arrow lands right in the royal castle, on the grounds of which Maid Marian is playing badminton with Lady Cluck.
As your lady in waiting, I'm waiting.
They are immediately charmed by the children, and we get backstory about Marian and Robin's relationship.
You're gonna have any kids?
I just love how unabashedly frank children can be sometimes.
So this is Sherwood Forest.
Yeah, I guess so.
And I'm so glad that the story folks got their act back together after the Aristocats. The sheriff takes taxes from the poor rabbit family, leading Robin to help them out and give Skippy a bow, which leads to Skippy meeting Maid Marian, introducing her to the audience. There is no wasted time in any of these scenes, no sequences added purely for entertainment value. Don't get me wrong, this is still a very entertaining and very funny movie, but the jokes are never at the expense of plot or themes or characterization, and are in fact often in service of them.
I'm scared of Prince John. He's cranky.
This is competent story structure. Take notes, y'all.
Death the tyrant!
Marian pining for Robin Hood and unsure if he still loves her leads into Robin pining for Marian and wondering if she still loves him.
Well, for one thing, you can't cook.
We then get probably the least organic character introduction in this movie, Friar Tuck just kind of sauntering into Robin and Little John's camp and wordlessly inviting himself to eat their food. This movie already has a Lorcana card for basically every named character, but I want one for this shitty carrot that Little John sneers at. It's got spunk. Through Tuck, our heroes learn that Prince John will be holding an archery tournament, the prize of which will be a kiss from Maid Marian. This gets Robin's immediate attention despite the very reasonable protests of his friends.
This will be my greatest performance.
The tournament itself is a great showcase of one of my favorite things about this movie, letting the characters interact with each other, specifically the heroes with the villains. Robin and Little John's disguises mean they have multiple scenes just having conversations with Prince John and the sheriff, making the beef between them feel a lot more personal than in, say, The Princess and the Frog, where Tiana doesn't see Dr. Facilier until the very end. This movie is almost a slice-of-life anime in that regard, which is why Part 4 of JoJo is the best one. Don't at me, I will not be taking comments on that particular take.
Hiss! You deliberately dodged.
Robin, disguised as a stork, heads to the fields to trade both literal and verbal arrows with the sheriff.
Robin Hood, he says. I'm tip-top all right, but I'm not as good as he is.
While Little John heads to the royal pavilion pretending to be a noble.
I am Sir Reginald, Duke of Chutney.
And having Phil Harris bounce off of Peter Ustinov is a real treat.
PJ, I like that. You know I do. Hiss, put it on my luggage.
Meanwhile, Sir Hiss is looking for our foxy hero using a fucking balloon he blew up from the inside. It makes no goddamn sense, but I am so here for it. My next D&D character is gonna have a snake familiar that's half in a balloon helicoptering around. Pretty soon the contestants have been winnowed to only Robin and the sheriff.
That's what you call pulling it back and letting it go, PJ.
And PJ, who is able to learn from his mistakes,
there's a benefit to losing,
cottons onto Robin's disguise this time and reveals and binds him. Gee, I wonder why furries, who tend to be kinkier than the general population, love this movie so much. I just have absolutely no idea what about this film could have awakened strange feelings in so many budding adolescents. Of course, Little John clearly doesn't have a bondage fetish and persuades the prince not to execute Robin.
Sheriff, release my buddy.
The royal lackeys are understandably confused but obey orders, letting Robin and Marion finally reunite properly. But of course, the burgeoning bromance between Phil Harris and Peter Ustinov must come to an end.
Not so hard, you mean thing.
And the sheriff figures out what's going on. We get the big fight scene.
Get your pies for the great pie fight.
This is one of the better ones in the canon. There's a lot of interesting staging, a variety of pairings, and everyone is fighting in character, including Prince John, who hides behind an ale barrel.
Seize the fat one!
Inevitably descends into ridiculous chaos.
Hey, who's driving this flying umbrella?
And this movie continues to not beat the horny allegations by having Lady Cluck get pantsed. Don't ask me how she's wearing underwear under her feathers, it's cartoon logic. Despite all the ruckus, everyone escapes into the woods.
Long live King Richard!
We then get the song Love, the only one not penned by Roger Miller, with the melody written by George Bruns himself with lyrics from Floyd Huddleston.
Love, it seems like only yesterday.
Fittingly, it's a very lovely tune, and the firefly-lit forest is the perfect setting for our breeding pair to keep things safe for work, since this is a kids' movie.
You're gonna have any kids?
This portrayal of anthro-romance is probably the part of this movie most foundational to the furry fandom. There is a lot of fan art of this scene, and the song was used right in the middle of Fantastic Mr. Fox, a more modern piece of furry bait. But like the rest of this film, this scene is more than just furry bait, and it's clear why this song was nominated for an Oscar.
Love goes on and on.
Love is followed immediately by another song, the Phony King of England. This sequence is infamous among Disney buffs as being almost entirely collaged from reused animation from prior films. At first blush, it would be very easy to point to this as evidence of Woolly Reitherman's laziness and cost-cutting, but the truth is that this decision was forced upon them. Like basically every other one of these movies, production on Robin Hood ran behind schedule, so this scene was cobbled together from recycled animation not to cut costs, but simply because there was not enough time to make new animation from scratch. Despite this time crunch, this film is otherwise rather light on reused animation, making this scene in context feel less like a cash grab ripoff and more like a love letter to the work that came before. As for the song itself, it seems to be very heavily based on an older song called The Bastard King of England, which is often attributed to Rudyard Kipling of all people, though that's likely an urban myth. There are a few different melodies that song has been sung to, but one particular one used by Oscar Brand in 1956 sounds very familiar.
God bless the bastard King of England.
Apart on the Phony King of England.
Some may feel this cheapens the film, but personally I think the fact that this sequence is referencing not just Disney's own animation history, but musical history as well, is very fitting. The song ends up being so catchy that the Sheriff of Nottingham himself is humming it as he strolls into the castle.
Let me try. Too late to be known as John the First, he's sure to be known as John the Worst.
Turns out Prince John is not a music fan.
Enough!
In the Unshaved Mouse's blog, he often talks about villains having a moment with a capital M that truly defines their villainy. And in my humble opinion, for Prince John, I have to say this scene is it. He has been relentlessly ridiculed and rebelled against, and he has had enough.
Double the taxes, triple the taxes.
No more Mr. Nice Prince. We now get to see the full extent of his pettiness, cruelty, and greed.
Squeeze every last drop out of those insolent musical peasants.
Every town has its ups and downs. Sometimes ups outnumber the downs. Not in Nottingham. I'm inclined to believe if we weren't so down, we'd up and leave. We'd up and fly if we had wings for flying. Can't you see the tears we're crying? Can't there be some happiness for me? Not in Nottingham. Every town has its ups and downs. Sometimes ups outnumber the downs, but not in Nottingham. I'm inclined to believe if we weren't so down, we'd up and leave. We'd up and fly if we had wings for flying. Can't you see the tears we're crying? Can't there be some happiness for me? Not in Nottingham. Not in Nottingham. Not in Nottingham. Nottingham's taxes are raised so high that soon almost the entire town are locked in jail for failure to pay.
Yep, I'm in here too.
The one place left to tax is the church itself, reflecting the historical John's own anti-clericalism. But when the sheriff takes from the poor box, Friar Tuck has had enough.
Get out of my church!
As I've mentioned, I'm no longer religious myself, and we're going to have a long discussion in the Hunchback video about my issues with the Catholic Church in specific, but in this story, in this context, Tuck and the church mice represent community, coming together to help those in need. Everything Christianity has claimed to stand for. By stealing from the poor to feed the rich, Prince John and his lackeys have broken the social contract. The entire point of taxes is to pool community resources. Those who have more are expected to give more to help those who have less. When taxes are inflicted indiscriminately in order to enrich the powerful with no thought for the people they are supposed to be leading, that is tyranny.
You want taxes? I'll give you taxes!
But one person can't hope to take on the system alone, and Friar Tuck is arrested. This is the main change this film makes from the Errol Flynn version, where it was made Marion who needed to be rescued for the climax. And honestly, I prefer this version. Yes, it does mean that after the Phony King of England, we don't see Marion again until the end when she marries Robin Hood, and her absence from the prison break is probably my biggest critique of this movie. She should have gotten more to do. But it reframes this final conflict from being about true love conquering all to needing to dismantle an unjust system. The fact that Prince John is so desperate to punish Robin Hood that he's willing to use a priest as bait
Hang Friar Tuck, a man of the church,
shows just how far gone he is and how much he needs to be taken down. The jailbreak is wonderfully tense, with Bruns' score setting the mood perfectly. First, Robin and Little John have to get past the sheriff and his vultures.
The safety's on old Betsy.
And once again, disguises are used to great effect, which I think is just a wonderful nod to that very first Robin Hood story.
You, let me loosen that bales.
Still not beating the horny allegations movie, this is not helping. Little John gets to work freeing the imprisoned townsfolk while Robin sneaks into PJ's boudoir to steal back the hoarded money.
Praise the Lord and pass the tax rebate.
Of course, all hell breaks loose when Sir Hiss wakes up and starts warning PJ and the guards, and though most of the villagers escape, Robin gets stuck inside the castle in order to rescue a kid that got left behind.
my baby!
There's a brief final showdown with the sheriff before Robin leaps into the moat only to get shot by arrows. This very end is easily the weakest part of the film, as there was no way in hell Disney were gonna kill off their title character. I'm not buying your tears, Phil Harris. Richard returns, Robin and Marion get married, and PJ Hiss and the sheriff get to do prison labor, at least until Richard dies and John becomes king. And that's kind of the issue with putting a monarchist spin on the Robin Hood tale, because in reality, there is no good King Richard who's gonna swoop back in and save us from the evil Prince John. The problem is the system that allows John to be in power in the first place. Stealing from the rich to feed the poor is a stopgap measure, a necessary one, absolutely, but the true solution to tyranny isn't scattered acts of civil disobedience, it's revolution.
Death the tyrant!
The worst influence the Robin Hood myth has ever had is on libertarians, because their inability to think critically made them only take away the surface, literal idea of taxes are bad. When learning about the American Revolution, they stopped listening after no taxation and missed the part about without representation. Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged has a character claiming to be a modern-day Robin Hood by stealing tax revenue from the government and giving it back to rich entrepreneurs in the form of gold bars. She and every other libertarian inspired by her idiotic toilet paper tomes have fully missed the point of Robin Hood. In medieval Europe, taxes were a form of oppression because it was the rich sucking out every spare coin from the peasantry, preventing them from building up wealth of their own so the nobility could remain in power. In a modern democracy, taxes are supposed to mostly come from the rich, to redistribute their wealth and make sure everyone is able to prosper. And yet the conservatives champing at the bit to reduce the tax burden on the wealthy are just reinventing feudalism all over again. Instead of paying taxes to a king, we're paying tariffs to businessmen. Instead of working the fields for our feudal lord, we're working minimum wage jobs whose pay rate hasn't increased in 50 years! Wage theft and inflation and the dismantling of social programs are the real taxes on the poor now. Despite that, Disney's Robin Hood is a phenomenal movie. The weak sauce ending aside, it is unwavering in its message of standing up to tyranny at all levels, from bureaucratic bullies to the king himself. On top of that, it has a toe-tapping score, iconic vocal performances, and some of the last animation work of the original masters of the Disney studio. Robin Hood slaps. One of my favorite webcomics is Lackadaisy. The premise is anthropomorphized cats running a speakeasy during Prohibition. It has memorable characters with painstakingly and deliberately unique designs, an intriguing storyline, and hands down the best artwork I've ever seen in the digital space. When the pilot episode for a cartoon version shadow dropped on YouTube a couple years ago, I squealed at a pitch that only dogs can hear. Go watch it right now, it's amazing. And yet when I showed the animation to my friends, I got into an argument with them about whether or not Lackadaisy counted as being Furry. My instinctive reaction was to say, no, it isn't. It doesn't feel furry, whatever that means. Furry stuff is cringe or horny, and this was just normal, it's just cats doing cat things. And they happen to stand on two legs and have opposable thumbs and wear suits and drink alcohol and play the saxophone. But it's not furry. But eventually I realized what I was doing. I had internalized this idea that furry stuff was bad, and so something that I liked couldn't be furry. I had to have a pretty frank reckoning with my own biases. By every definition, Lackadaisy is absolutely a furry property. Sure, the art style is different from the typical furry art style, but otherwise, it checks every box. And that's okay! There's nothing wrong with that! Something being furry doesn't make it any more cringe than any other piece of media that people obsess over. If a piece of furry media is good, you don't have to justify your love of it, whether or not you yourself are a furry. But where does that idea of the standard furry art style come from? It comes from Robin Hood! Like seriously, go to Fur Affinity and look over the fursonas you find there, then go and look at Robin and Prince John and Friar Tuck and Lady Cluck. Modern fursonas are a little more cartoonified, with larger eyes and squishier noses, but I think that's probably due to anime influences. At their core, most modern fursonas can still trace their artistic roots back to Robin Hood. But again, why this film? Animation has had anthropomorphized animals since the beginning. Pete and Oswald are just two examples, but why is it that fursonas don't look like Mickey Mouse or Bugs Bunny? My hypothesis is that they're both too cartoony and too human. Yes, Daffy and Donald are ducks with big orange bills, but they've got massive cartoon eyes, wholly unphysical cartoon character body builds, and hands that are just human hands colored differently. These are just funny animals, to use Voody's original parlance. But Robin Hood is clearly a fox, drawn as if a zoologist speculatively crafted a sapient being that evolved naturally from a real fox. He has opposable thumbs, but they're part of what are clearly animal paws. He doesn't have a jaw full of rectangular prism molars, he has fox teeth and a fox muzzle. He is an animal, walking and talking and acting like a human, and this movie was really the first time that was depicted in a film intended for a wide audience. That is, aside from Song of the South, which is very justifiably forgotten nowadays. But boy, did Robin Hood have an audience. It made $32 million from its initial release and a re-release in 1982 off a budget of $5 million. It was also one of the first of the canon to be released on home video, getting multiple releases on VHS and DVD. More than one generation now has grown up with an anthropomorphic fox being their introduction to the Robin Hood legend, and I will die on the hill that this is the best Robin Hood movie we've ever had. Being the piece of media that created the furry fandom might not sound as glamorous as Fantasia debuting stereo sound or Bambi jump-starting the environmentalist movement, but how many other films can claim to have been such a cultural touchstone? In Robin Hood's wake, anthro-rep in media exploded, pardon the pun. Children's film in the 80s was dominated by Don Bluth's Secret of Nim and An American Tale, stories of bipedal animal societies hidden from human view, featuring designs evoking the fox-focused flick that Bluth himself was a credited animator on. Disney itself capitalized on Robin Hood's popularity in the 80s with a slew of Saturday morning cartoons starring anthropomorphized critters like Gummy Bears, Tailspin, Rescue Rangers, and DuckTales, and later Goof Troop and the Goofy movies. It even got a spiritual sequel in Zootopia, whose director Byron Howard wanted to make a film like Robin Hood. And Zootopia has gone on to have its own influence on the furry fandom, for better or worse. There has been a glut of media for furries to engage in since the 70s, and that is almost entirely due to the success of Robin Hood. But the main reason why Robin Hood has been embraced by furries is not just because of the anthropomorphized animal characters or the unintentional innuendos that piqued the interest of pubescent teens, but because it's a good movie. There's a lot to love here, whether you're an otherkin or a normie. Embrace the cringe, give this classic a watch, and remember the true message of Robin Hood.
Death the tyrant!
As always, I am deeply grateful to my Patreon patrons, particularly Gurgi85, Avery and their ADHDs, Jinx KB, Savannah Mighty Zebra, Tony Houst, JC Alexandre, Bewildereye, Checo, CBL, Daniel Osbjörnsen, and Sugar Cubed Collider. This content is sponsored by viewers like you. It's only $5 a month, or 10 if you want me to say your name at the end here. I've also announced some patron stretch goals at which I will make some fun music videos. Either way, join me next time as we visit the 100-acre wood with the many adventures of Winnie the Pooh.